The session is Quality is Job One, ensuring automation in your team's quality process. So a little about me. I'm Eric Landis with Agile Thought, and I am a PST, Professional Scrum Trainer. I'm a DevOps consultant in our transformation practice, and really have a lot of years of experience doing both Agile coaching, ALM, and DevOps, those kinds of things. And testing is kind of a passion of mine when we talk about software development. So that's why I like to talk a bit about how that works within development teams and within Agile. So today what I want to do is talk a little bit about continuous testing. How many folks have heard that phrase, continuous testing? Anybody who hasn't? We've got some. So I'm a DevOps guy, so automated testing is very crucial to having a DevOps culture. We're going to go over benefits of those patterns. If things get a little boring, I've got somebody back there who'll give me an air guitar, I've been told. So I think there we go. That's awesome. So just tell me if we need to spice it up. Then we're going to talk about how we can improve test automation. And I want to give you a couple of scenarios of where we've introduced test automation and how you might be able to do that. And then if we have time, a little Q&A. So continuous testing. Let's go through, how many folks here are developers or coders, would you say? How many folks are QA or testers? And BAs, QA, or BAs or program project managers, that kind of thing? All right. And how many folks are doing Scrum or some type of Agile? Okay, awesome. So I will talk a bit and make some assumptions about Agile, just FYI. So continuous testing means your team will integrate testing into everything, in my opinion. So what does that mean? We're going to test in conjunction with coding. So if your teams are not testing with coders, we code something quickly and then we test it, it's going to be hard to get to continuous testing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And maybe you don't have testers, right, with continuous testing. Maybe you're going to have coders or BA will just be engineers with that skill set. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. I was at a DevOps Summit recently in Vegas, baby, and that's okay. It's actually not my kind of town, but the summit was pretty awesome. And when we were there, one of the participants was Microsoft, and they talked about their journey from, in 2010, they were in a software development, kind of a standard phase every 2 years, we're deploying releases, to a more continuous delivery. And one of the things they mentioned that caught my ear is that they no longer have coders or testers, they have engineers on their team. And engineers who will test, engineers who will code, and that's really their focus. So I want you to start thinking about that. Is that something we can do, getting more of that kind of skill set? Let's think of folks as engineers, not necessarily testers, coders, BAs, right? Another thing, if you want to get to continuous testing, does anybody have this, a QA sprint? Ooh, nobody's probably going to admit it, but yeah, don't do that. You really want testing to be integrated within your sprint. So I assume that you're doing Scrum. You might do Kanban, that's fine, as some type of Agile process. But if you're doing Scrum specifically, the intent is that we are doing all the work that needs to be to get your software to production in that sprint, right? So you can use things like definition of done to help you understand that. So if you don't mind my asking, you're doing a QA sprint, is that by desire or, yeah, that's good.
People decided they weren't ready to let go of waterfall, so I got myself a QA sprint.
Right, yeah, and that is sometimes comforting to folks, right? To have that, oh, we can test there. But a good argument for not having that is we really want to have quick feedback to the coders, and I'm sure you know that, so that we don't have as much waste, because you're going to introduce a lot of waste when you push testing further away from the actual coding. So that's an argument you can use. But again, I would think I'm preaching to the choir here. We don't really want to have a QA sprint, right, for continuous testing. And maybe automation will help you, right? So when I think of testing, this is kind of a pyramid I use that talks about the different types of testing. Unit testing, to me, unit testing is automated. Software developers, coders, should be creating unit tests. They should be very small, and they should be quick. And we should have lots of them for our code base. Acceptance testing is the next thing up, and we'll dive a little deeper into that. That really will help you get to smaller batch sizes, I believe, if you're doing some automated acceptance testing like Cucumber, that kind of thing. And then finally, really a lot of the automation that we think about, which is UI testing, using something like Selenium to do our regression testing and our smoke tests, that's a little smaller set of automation. So, and finally, the manual testing is up here with exploratory. So what I like to say is automation thrives here from unit tests up to regression testing. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but really general guidance I like to give you. By the way, anybody disagreeing with that? Have a different take on that? Awesome. So to kind of put on its head the engineer comment I made earlier, I also want to mention everyone's a tester. So if we're going to build quality, and if I'm a coder, I don't just worry, let those tester folks do their testing when I'm done. I should be worrying about tests early on. BAs, security, your security people. I've worked with security folks, and for our infrastructure, we're going to write tests to make sure our infrastructure passed security measures. We've written tests around, hey, are we in compliance with what security expects for our release pipelines? So a lot of different ways we might be a tester, right? But the attitude is we're all testing and we're all ensuring quality is done there. Has anybody heard of the Three Amigos concept? So if you have, it's a good thing. It's at the beginning of a sprint or the beginning of working on a software user story. My team will get together with the coder, tester, maybe the product owner, 30 minutes maybe. We work together and determine what we're going to test, what we're going to code, and kind of a time frame, right? And it's really just more communication about the actual requirements and what we're going to test. We can talk about what we're going to automate, but it's really those three people getting together early on and testing, right? So benefits of test automation. So how many folks are doing some kind of like Selenium or any kind of regression testing? Okay, awesome. How many folks are doing also unit testing? Those are kind of the two main ones, right? Cool. Anybody, give me what's your code coverage? Anybody throw it out? Anybody know? Anybody over 50% code coverage with their unit tests, we'll say? Kind of? Okay. Not that you have to be. It's really up to you on the organizational side, but on unit testing, you should have, hey, we're going to hit this percentage of code coverage. So that's a metric that will help you get to your automated tests and help you determine exactly what that might mean, right? What our automation means, and it will help us as we're determining how much work we're going to have to do each sprint. So automating tests correctly Obviously, it's repeatable, right? We want to repeat the same test every time. That validates the requirements, so it's very easy to do with automation rather than manual testing. The one point I want to make here, should reduce your total testing time. So I was with a company, we had a regression test that would take 8 weeks. And we automated that, and we were able to get that down to around a week of testing, regression testing with automation. So you should have those kinds of metrics when you're talking about, hey, do we want to automate this or not? If your manual testing takes 10 minutes to do regression testing, you probably don't need to automate it, right? The final point, to automate tests, small chunks. If you're not doing small stories, small requirements, it's fairly hard to do that, right? We'll just ignore that. Unit testing, real quick, I'll go through this. Tell me if you disagree. Unit testing is for coders. You should only test one thing. And we're not integrated. We're not doing, regression testing here. This is really to test, is the code that I'm writing doing what I think it's supposed to do, right? It's really for the developers. Yes? Typically, no. Yeah, typically I'm trying to keep data store out of that. I'm testing logic, right? I'm testing the stuff I write as a developer. We can assume that Oracle or SQL or whatever, they have their own testing, and typically, unless I'm doing something really, really difficult, I want to keep my logic in my code, and the database is a store typically, right?
What I mean is, like, people had some pushback on unit tests by saying, well, but do I need to connect to a database?
Yep, and those would be covered in your regression or potentially your acceptance tests. So, like, I could see I could see where you need to do that if you're dependent on data, right? If there's some data that you need to connect to, and we can talk in detail if you want afterwards about that. But I would typically make unit testing not touching any like data store or anything. For one thing, it's going to slow it down. It doesn't make it fast. And I think there's other places for that. Anybody disagree? No? Yep.
I disagree only in the sense that I think it should never touch a database at the unit testing level, like ever. I can't think of a good reason why you would need to do that.
Okay, I like that.
So like I'll just push it further.
Awesome. Like that. And I'll put a star on that. Like I said, I really think there's other places you can do automated testing against a database. And typically I'm going to do that with my regression tests with APIs, right? Potentially your acceptance tests, you might do that. The other place, this unit testing is really good for test-driven development. Anybody doing TDD, by the way, here? Yeah, all right. I'm a huge fan of test-driven development. It is a hard sell for most developers that I've seen. And we'll touch base on this at the end of this talk. But the reason I like test-driven development is we start with tests, and there's a couple of great benefits you get from doing that. First, your code coverage is going to be good because you're starting with the test, and you're going to be writing your code to that test level typically. So a lot of benefits from it, and we can talk a little bit about that. Let's see, is that? There we go. Missed that one. Regression testing. Hold on. Yeah, real quick, smoke tests, automated, typically UI type tests. We really want to run those at the end of our continuous delivery. How many folks have continuous delivery pipelines and they're automated at least a couple environments? All right, sweet. So if you are automating your deployments, you certainly want to have smoke tests to validate that your deployments are working. So I don't have to have somebody manually do that. And I typically am using a tool like Selenium for that. And smoke tests are typically a subset of this regression testing. And regression tests are kind of your whole suite of tests. We want to make sure when we introduce new features, we're not breaking something that was working before. And regression testing, again, is using something like Selenium. We can automate that in our CD pipeline. I'm typically running those outside of my pipeline deployment, though. So if you don't have any automation yet, just start automating. Your next story, let's start, right? Let's do a unit test, let's do Selenium, let's start doing that. And you're saying, that's great, Eric. How do I do that? How do I start? Well, let's talk first about what automation we currently have. I think we talked, we have some people who have regression testing. Somebody give me your percentage of regression tests over manual. Tell me how much time you have in manual and how much time in automated regression type tests. Have any volunteers? No? Anybody have like, anybody doing it? Yeah.
70% of our tests are automation, 30% or maybe 25% of manual.
Really? Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. You want to help me teach this? Yeah. That's great, man. What do you use? What tools?
Selenium and Python.
Oh. And Python?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Very cool. And how many of your testers code, percentage-wise?
Sorry, how many?
Yeah, how many testers? Do your testers code, or you have?
Yeah. So right now we have a team of 5, and 3 of them they know how to do automation.
Awesome.
So they are like full-time automation testers right now. So they write all the codes. I mean, I'm one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 people I can say who are focused on automation. 2 of them are manual.
Awesome. All right. Anybody have a different story that they want to share? Nobody? I'm trying to think. Yeah, over here.
Share one. So, as an agile project, we kind of talk a lot about this, and it's really interesting that in one particular team, it was by force that they had to become engineers. It was really interesting because the team started growing, and all of a sudden we had a lot of developers for one QA.
Uh-huh.
Guys, this is moving so slow that we have to say, okay, everybody stop, everybody's going to test, but we're not going to stop developing. So let's pair 2 developers, and we're going to actually start writing the scripts to test by the same time that we're doing the code. Like basically pair program. One is
Mhm.
developing.
Nice.
And they loved it, and that's how we started talking about, well, you're no longer QA, you're engineers. And
Nice.
everybody developed.
Oh, I love it. I love that story. That's great. And that's, unfortunately, that's typically the way it happens, right? Is we kind of have to, as opposed to, typically teams I'm with don't have time. You know, we don't have time to automate, right? I will argue until I'm out of breath that you will have time, but you need to make time for that. And, you know, I'll just continue to argue that you need to make time to automate and to learn to automate. So, 3 Amigos, I talked about that. We review the test in a lightweight way. You know, that talk about pair programming, that's another way you could do this, right? Have a tester and developer work together to actually develop the code. One is kind of reading the requirements, and the other, you know, is coding. If you haven't done pair programming, there's another technique, mob programming, which definitely management will not like because the whole team is coding. But in maybe 1 or 2 hour type sessions, there's a lot of learning that can come out of that from tester, BA, coder perspectives. We all get together, we watch one person code to a story, and we give feedback on, hey, you should do that or you shouldn't do that. So a lot of different techniques. I think the biggest takeaway there is collaboration. Don't be the lone warrior or whatever, you know, out there coding. We want to get together and collaborate on the tests. Other one, make your batch sizes small. I'm typically advising clients user stories and PBIs if you can get them to 1 or 2 days complete, and by complete I mean tested and coded. That's good. You know, I had a team. We got them They're very inconsistently delivering. We were able to use a technique I'll show you here real quick, behavior-driven development, and we were able to get our estimates from, typically we're using, they're about 3 to 5 days of time actually taking to consistently having 1 or 2 days per story, very consistent. So a lot of these techniques will help you get your batch sizes small. It's really a good way to do that. Now, how many folks have heard of Cucumber or behavior-driven development? Awesome. Anybody using it? Yeah. Used to. Okay. Anybody using it now? Yeah. So I'm a big fan of this. This is a way to do test automation. If you're interested in it, they have documents out there. Besides test automation, there's a really good reason to use this. It helps get your batch sizes smaller. So this is the technique we used for the example I just gave you. With Gherkin, you have a syntax of given, I do something, I do a scenario, or given a scenario, when I do something, then this happens, right? And I can automate that, but the cool thing is, even if I don't automate it, it really gets whoever's writing these out to think about the scenarios that are going to happen for the story. And that's how we got stories split very small. This has English language type syntax and a lot of benefits, like I said, whether you automate or not. Anybody use Fitness as a testing environment? It's a little bit older. I use that. Uncle Bob Martin went through a session with him, week-long session. We used Fitness. Probably my first Agile project was using this framework, and it was probably the most rock-solid framework ever. The benefits of the Fitness framework, which is a wiki that people can edit, is that non-technical folks can go to a website and see your tests, whether they pass or not. So that's a little different. The Cucumber options are usually very developer specific, and they're in the IDE. Fitness is a little more user-centric. Also, it's very good with spreadsheet type problems. So those are 2 acceptance testing frameworks. There's definitely others. But let me just show you real quickly and this is in .NET. You have this in Java, of course, or other frameworks as well, JavaScript. But let me show you the Gherkin syntax here. So I'm using something called SpecFlow. And in SpecFlow, you add a feature file. And in that feature file, I can put in multiple scenarios, right? So we write the scenarios in an English language way. So this is kind of from my bowling kata. And if you know bowling, this will make sense. Given a bowler rolled a 1 and so on. And here's kind of all the scenarios. So I can give a scenario and say we bowled 2 in frame 2 and so on. When I view the bowler's score, so if I can get down here, the result should be 10, right? And I'm trying to show this to you. So this is the way you connect that. And you can see this passed, but Eric, how did you automate that and pass it? Well, you create a steps file that hooks this English syntax actually into the code, right? So I have this feature steps file that links to it, and if you use this game roll and that kind of stuff, that's the actual code I'm passing the information from those scenarios into the code. So again, not a tutorial or anything on SpecFlow, but I just wanted to show you how this can be done, and you can actually take this stuff from your acceptance criteria, paste it into your feature file, and start creating automated tests if you want to. Any questions on that? All right. So introduce your testing plan in your backlog. So how many folks have a definition of done? All right, awesome. So if you're starting to introduce automated testing, let's try to put that automation statistic as part of your definition of done. For instance, we'll put in code coverage, right? We'll say we need to have 80% code coverage or something like that, and that's part of our definition of done. So we're constantly monitoring that throughout the sprint, right? That also gives a quality assurance to folks, right? It gives quality assurance to your product owner, gives quality assurances to other folks. The other thing you can do if you don't want to, if you have that but you have a lot of technical debt, we haven't done a lot of automation, is we can actually add technical debt to our backlog. I've done that with teams, and really, if you get your product owner understanding the quality concepts, they'll be very open to doing that, but sometimes they're not. So I got the 5-minute thing there, so let's try and get to a scenario, and let's talk this through, and if you have questions, just talk to me about it. So this scenario is we've got a legacy application, and I've got one of these out there. They're using, what are they using? Holy crap, it's like WCF, if you know what that is, Windows Communication Foundation, which is just terrible. And it's like, 5,000 lines of code in one function. I mean, just really, really bad code. And so the teams are trying to work through that. So how would I start automating tests against that, right? It's pretty tough when I have a legacy application. How many folks are in the legacy camp? Have any are doing that? So most functions are not going to allow you to do standard unit testing, right? They're not encapsulated. They're probably not following solid principles. So how do we get that? So in this scenario, we eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? Also, if you are looking to do legacy apps, there is a good book on that by Michael Feathers on unit testing legacy applications. Highly recommend it. So what I would first do, let's get out of that, is let's assume we have an API, right? So what I would do is I would use potentially Selenium, but I could use SpecFlow as well, right? So I would create a new feature file and basically write a test against that API level, right? And if it's an API or it's a local DLL or whatever, that's what I would be writing that test against. So has anybody had experience doing that and tried that? So let's say, let's do this feature file. No. All right, so let's say we're going against the Twitter search API. So just for argument's sake. So I'm going to call this Twitter search. So as you'll notice, we have a standard file here. And what I'm going to do is take those parameters. So in Twitter search, I'm going to say I have entered, let's say, hashtag DevOps into the search box. And while this isn't really legacy, this will give you an idea of what you could do, right? When I press search, the result should be greater than one result on the screen. So why am I doing such a simple thing, right? What I really am trying to do here is I'm trying to create a test that's going to test really the API for changes, right? I want it to take the right amount of arguments, so I'm going to write that in here, and that it's going to take the right function, and I'm really just starting a simple test, and I'm going to start it simply against the API, and then I'm going to add some code to that, and I'm going to run it against Twitter, and now I'll put that into my continuous integration or continuous delivery to see how that works, right? So that's one way you could do this, and I'm most familiar with SpecFlow. If you have Selenium, you can do a simple thing, but again, I would be writing my automated tests when I'm starting out. I would start out at that UI level where things are probably a little more granular than the actual code, and then as we start changing the code, let's make those into smaller chunks and do the unit testing with new features added on to the legacy app. So anybody have different ways they might do that? All right, cool. So that is, from current slide here, that's that first scenario, legacy. Now let's get to that scenario where my team hates test-driven development. As I said, I'm a big fan. But let's say most of your team wants to move to test-driven development and some of the key team members are resistant. How can we convince them? And if you have a different scenario, let me know. We can talk that through. For me, all right, well, that slide got deleted, but basically what I'm going to do is I am going to do a couple things. And you mentioned it over here, which is pair with a team member, right? So we're going to do some pair programming just a little bit and see how we do test-driven development and see how that works with the team member. Again, if the team member is still resistant, and I'll show you this, I use a simple kata, which really helps people to understand and practice test-driven development. Has anybody done coding katas at all? Yeah. Successful or no? Yeah? Awesome. What did you use for your the bowling game? Did you do Game of Life or anything like that? No. Yeah, that's a fun one. Nice. So positive experience. I like to hear that. Anybody else? Anybody have negative experience with coding kata and how it worked out? No. So if you don't know what a coding kata is, it's basically a way to practice development, and it's a very easy way for people who don't know how to code to kind of learn what developers are doing, even if they don't become great developers. And it also teaches test-first principles. So typically what I'll do if I'm running a coding kata is we start, and here I'll do this, we'll start with a brand new project, and you don't have to. I've also been with coding katas where we had a lot of this set up. My mouse is going crazy. Hello. There we go. And let's just say I'm just going to do a class here. And basically I'm just going to call it bowling example, but we start with a brand new, let's say that, brand new application, and we're going to go through an application, in this case bowling game. We're going to create an application that runs will score your bowling, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's, we start with tests, right? So if I'm running the kata, I'm going to say, okay, create this. We're going to call it bowling game. And now we're going to do a test. And again, don't mind what IDE I'm using. You might use something different, but we're going to call it bowling tests. Doesn't really matter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the test first. Yeah, that's fine. And we're going to call this test method bowling. We're going to say rolling a 1. And what I do in the test, in this, is I write what I expect the code to do before I write the code, right? So this is test-driven development. So I'll say roll, that didn't work. We'll say roll Roll, something like that, and roll equals 1. Oops. Equals 1. And then I'm going to say assert that are equal. I'm going to do an assertion. Hello. All right. So I know that's going to fail, but what I'm doing is I'm describing what I think my application should do. And in our coding kata, it's really easy to do this because we kind of know that everybody knows the game of bowling typically and how to score it. And if not, there's somebody who's going to be able to tell them. And so typically in the coding kata, that's what you're going to do. You're going to help your teammates learn how to code. We code this bowling game and we run the test. So right now, if I ran this unit test, right, it should fail. We know it should fail. And then what I'm going to do in this kata is I'm going to create the bowling class that does the things like takes rolls, figures out what frame you're in, all those rules that are in there, and how do we, when we get to spares and strikes, that's always fun to figure out the scoring, right? So that's all logic, but what we're doing is we're writing the testing in first, and then we're creating the actual software. So does that make sense? There's other very more complex than bowling, like Game of Life is one that I've done, and we did that with TypeScript. That was interesting. But the idea is we spend some time, maybe half hour, maybe an hour, team practices development, and then we go out and do this. This would be a good way to introduce people to test-driven development. The company I was at where we did this quite often, we were actually doing katas every day for about a 3-month period. Like in the morning before you came to work. We had testers going in there who had not coded before, learning how that worked. So very beneficial practice if you haven't done that. So that was kind of my last scenario. I was able to get through this. I'm very excited. In summary, real quick, we talked about why you should automate if you want to get to continuous testing. And hopefully I gave you some ideas how you can get your teams doing this, whether I have a legacy app or people who don't want to do TDD. If you have different scenarios, hit me up after this session and we can talk about it. Any questions? I'll throw this over to you. Yes?
Where do you draw the line with mocking frameworks? Like, what level of material would you stop at?
What level of?
What level of the test journey would you stop at?
Either between acceptance tests and unit testing, regression is not going to be mocking. So it would be definitely in the unit tests I'm going to use mocking. I may use that in acceptance tests if I want those to be fast. But if I'm doing that legacy application and I'm running an acceptance test against that, I'm not going to mock that, right? So it's, as a good consultant would say, it depends. Anything else? Yes?
Just where you mentioned you were doing kind of with testers in the morning before work, did you do any capability assessment or desires for those people to be there?
Yeah, that's a great point. It was totally volunteer, right? It wasn't mandatory. But at first there was actually a huge groundswell that people really wanted to understand coding. A lot of testers really wanted to see it. And it's kind of nice because it's no pressure, right? You get in there, and if you can't do it or follow along, it's okay. People will help, or it's a really low stress way for them to start developing, really, in my opinion. And you have to have the right person leading it too.
What was the intention, or what percentage right
Mhm.
through the end?
It actually was. It actually was really good attendance for the first 3 months, and then when an application needed a lot of help, that's really when everybody couldn't do it basically. So I'm being told we're at the end here. If you want to talk to me, I'm around afterwards. I'd love to talk more about this, but thank you. I really appreciate it.